And welcome to the Forum at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Spencer Graves. I'm a member of the Forum Committee. This forum is a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those involving ethical values in the contemporary world. It has been doing this since 1943. Descriptions of most of these forums since 2012 are searchable at kkfi.org, and podcasts are available for most of them. This program is live streamed via YouTube. If you log in, you can post questions in the chat, which will be asked of the speaker on your behalf, time permitting, and I'm going to need some help from somebody, Renee or somebody, to monitor the chat for me. People in the room with me are asked to silence your cell phones. Today, our guest is Maria Stephan, half of the dynamic duo of Chenoweth and Stephan, who I know as the leading researcher on violence and nonviolence. The two of them have written two books that I know about. In 2021, Role of External Support for Nonviolent Campaigns, Poisoned, Callous, or Holy Grail. In 2011, they wrote a book on why civil resistance works. In 29, Maria published, edited a book on civilian jihad, nonviolent campaigns by Muslims. By far the best research I've seen comparing the relative effectiveness of violence and nonviolence has been by Chenoweth and Stephan. The other researchers study violence or nonviolence, but not in a comparative fashion. Maria holds a PhD in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. She worked at the U.S. Department of State as the lead foreign affairs officer for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations before working for several years at the U.S. Institute of Peace. At the latter, she developed a program of nonviolent action. Today, she is co-lead and chief organizer of the Horizons Project, which serves as an organizing platform dedicated to strengthening multiracial democracy in the U.S. and globally. Our forum will start with Maria responding to questions from me for about 30 minutes. We will then pause for donations. This will be followed by questions and answers from the audience to fill the hour. So let's start, Maria. What are the most important things you want to communicate to our audience?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Spencer, and thanks for inviting me to join your program. It's good to be with you all today. I think the main message, every day we wake up and it seems like we're barraged with a series of crises here in the United States and around the world. Whether it's the rise in threats and political violence in the United States, kind of the resurgence of authoritarianism. We have the standard bearer of one of our main political parties promising to be a dictator on day one if reelected. We have recurrence of police brutality that's undermining kind of the basic human rights and civil liberties of Black Americans in this country. So there are a lot of challenges internationally. I'm sure we're all seized with the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, in the war between Israel and Hamas. We're following the continued bloodshed and humanitarian crisis in Sudan that has displaced, I believe, around 3 million people. We're seeing 2 years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a continuation of war and suffering there, and all the environmental challenges, the climate crisis. So it seems that we're being hit on all sides. And something that we discuss a lot at the Horizons Project, which is focused on strengthening democracy here at home and also internationally, is the need to balance urgency with hope and agency. And so we need to continue to be seized with the reality of these challenges in the United States and internationally, these interconnected challenges, while at the same time going back to the fundamentals that we are capable of bringing about change. Any positive change in this country has come about as the result of people coming together across difference and using different forms of nonviolent action to challenge injustices and to bring about a better society and a better world. And so I think returning to some of those fundamentals, that nonviolent action, which is something I've focused on for about 3 decades, both in a research sense and also very practically, both in government and nonprofit sectors, I believe that nonviolent action, even though its effectiveness has taken a dip, has declined in effectiveness in recent years, I still believe that nonviolent action is the most powerful force available to humankind. And I think that investing in nonviolent alternatives, whether it's in strategic nonviolent action, civil resistance, dialogue, conflict resolution, civilian protection, mediation, we need to massively invest in these alternatives if we want to hope to be able to transform our country and certainly the world. So that's the main message I want to leave with folks: the need for urgency and agency. And yes, nonviolent action remains the most powerful force available to humankind.
So, if I hear you correctly, the success of nonviolence in terms of actually getting governmental change has declined in recent years. But what about your work with Chenoweth? My summary was that 25% of the violent revolutions were successful and 53% of the nonviolent revolutions. So you were twice as likely in the 20th century to be successful with nonviolence as with violence. But more importantly to me is that if you looked at the change in level of democratization before versus after, what we found is that the violent campaign, on average at least, your comment.
Yeah, so just to folks who are familiar with the research. So Erica Chenoweth, who's a professor at Harvard, Erica and I together spent several years collecting data on all the known major violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 up, through the century. These were maximalist campaigns. So these were major political campaigns challenging incumbent regimes and foreign military occupations. And so we were, interested in which form of resistance, where the primacy of tactics were either violent or nonviolent, which campaigns had been more effective. And to cut a long story short, the major nonviolent campaigns were twice as successful as the armed insurgencies, succeeding about twice as often. The main reason for that was that the nonviolent campaigns attracted significantly higher and more diverse participation, were more likely to prompt loyalty shifts in the regime's key pillars of support, and were able to exert pressure and leverage much more effectively than the armed insurgencies. And the other part of the research, as you noted, Spencer, is that we found a very strong correlation between nonviolent resistance and democratization. As you noted, in about the 25% of campaigns where the violent insurgency was successful, so think about in northern Vietnam, think about Maoist China, Algeria, those campaigns were successful by our definition, but almost never, in less than, I believe, 3% of the cases, did the armed insurgencies then pave the way to a democracy. So often the regimes that emerged were more tyrannical, dictatorial, and often there was a relapse back into civil war following the success of armed insurgencies. So we found, the bottom line is that we found that not only were the nonviolent campaigns much more effective than the armed insurgencies in achieving their major goals, they were also much more likely to result in democratic and peaceful societies.
So how was Israel fit in that pattern?
So, you know, one interesting thing in my research, both in my dissertation and in the book Civilian Jihad, which is on the history of nonviolent struggle in the greater Middle East, and then also one of the chapters in Why Civil Resistance Works was about the first Palestinian Intifada. So I was very interested as a scholar of civil resistance in when and why self-determination struggle succeeded. So I was very interested in kind of comparing Palestine, East Timor, and Kosovo. And so, so one interesting thing to note, important thing I think to note in this context, as this horrific tragedy continues to unfold in Gaza following the terrible Hamas attack on October 7th, is that there is actually a long history of Palestinian nonviolent resistance against the Israeli occupation. And we can lose sight of that, especially in moments like this. And I often would hear people asking, well, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? If only there were Palestinian Gandhis. And, in fact, we know that there have been many Palestinian Gandhis. And in the leading proponents of nonviolent resistance have often been those who have been arrested, detained, deported, even assassinated. And so I, was particularly interested in the first Palestinian Intifada, which was the uprising against the Israeli occupation in the late 1980s. And I was interested in that struggle not because it was wholly successful. In our data set in Why Civil Resistance Work, the first Intifada is coded as a partial success, meaning it paved the way to the negotiations and the Oslo peace accords, but it did not achieve meaningful self-determination, much less Palestinian statehood. But I was interested in that period of time, especially the first 18 months of the first Intifada, because I believe Palestinians achieved more in advancing their self-determination struggle during that 18-month period, when the primacy of tactics used were protests, boycotts, strikes, creating parallel education system, victory gardens. So this whole range of nonviolent actions that involved every segment of Palestinian society. It was led by Palestinians in the occupied territories, not by the PLO on the outside that had been relying for decades on armed attacks and terrorism. This was an uprising led by Palestinians living under occupation. And I was very interested in the organization of the first Intifada, how the main factions came together to create a united national leadership, how they disseminated leaflets or bayanat that described the daily tactics of the Intifada, the massively participatory nature. So I think it's important to, even in this period, to recall that there is this history. The context has changed a lot since that time period. And the Oslo Accords, which brought to power, incidentally, the Oslo Accords brought to power a Palestinian Authority that had been operating outside of the occupied territory. So those who were leading the first Intifada, this remarkable uprising, were sidelined. They were not the lead negotiators, and those who were representing Palestinians were those who had been fighting with armed insurgency on the outside for many, many years, and that became the Palestinian Authority. And so now the challenge is the Israeli bombardment following the very horrific Hamas action on October 7th has been disproportionate. 30,000 people have died, including 12,000 at least children, Palestinian children. And so the response is terrible. And so now the question becomes, what is the future? Like, how is it possible to reimagine a strategy of collective liberation and self-determination in this context? And I do still believe, notwithstanding all that is happening right now, that this continues to be the only way out of this terrible situation and the only way to achieve peace with justice for both peoples on both sides of the Green Line. And that is through nonviolent action and civil resistance. And that resistance has to include Palestinians inside the occupied territories, Israelis inside Israel and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then people who are in other countries like the United States, whose government is firmly backing the occupation and backing a right-wing government right now. And so that continues for me to remain the main hope and possibility for the situation over there.
Talk about Mubarak Awad. Awad, do you know how?
Yes.
I assume, I believe you know him, and um, talk about his role in that, if you like.
Yeah, so Mubarak Awad, Palestinian American, who played a very active role in the lead up to and during the first Palestinian Intifada, a leading proponent of nonviolence. He, was conducting trainings in nonviolence in the territories, was involved in various nonviolent actions, and he was arrested and eventually deported by the Israeli government, during that period of time. And so Mubarak now, as the co-founder of Nonviolence International, has been very focused on strengthening nonviolence amongst Palestinians and raising awareness of what is happening over there, the dynamics of the occupation. So he continues to be a very important voice for Palestinian nonviolence.
Just a shameless plug. He's going to be here May 4th and 5th, Saturday and Sunday. There's a flyer on some of the seats here. I'm recruiting people to help or, organize this. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. He was eventually. He was actually deported in '88, relatively early in the Intifada, and they defeated it by deporting, according to Mary Elizabeth King, who followed on research of yours, and you. There's a chapter in your civilian jihad book um, that they deported something like 481 and incarcerated, jailed between, I don't know, 50 and 150,000 Palestinians. Like they couldn't find the organizers, right, for the nonviolent resistance. You want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I did interviews on both sides of the Green Line while writing my dissertation. And so I remember interviewing retired Israeli generals, IDF, Israeli Defense Force generals, and one in particular, one of his responses when we were talking about what made the First Intifada different compared to other periods of Palestinian resistance. And he acknowledged that what was different was the mass participation. Everyone was participating, women, children, professionals, workers, everybody was in. And he said, yeah, and we don't do Gandhi well, meaning the Israeli government and IDF had a difficult time responding to the mass participation in the uprising. And so, yes, the response was predictably repressive, with all the arrests, deportations, imprisonment, killings that happened during that time. But I would note that over the course of the first Intifada, there was coverage. It was very clear that this was, an unarmed civilian population challenging a military occupation. And so there was a lot of media coverage. People may not know that there were a number of Israeli Jews who were actively participating in the campaigns of the First Intifada, so especially in the town of Beit Zahor. So there were joint Israeli-Palestinian actions. A number of American diaspora members came over, so there was a lot of solidarity action. For the very first time, when the news was covering the kind of disproportionate response and the repressive reaction of the Israeli government under then Shamir to the uprising, for the very first time, the United States withheld its veto in the United Nations when there was a resolution condemning the Israeli response. That was the first time that had happened. And so it's worth thinking about, what would have prompted that response, that reaction, and, to the difference of things, events that transpire before and after. So, that's the thing. When you study nonviolent resistance, the sad truth is that nonviolent kind of movements are almost always responded to with violence. It's like one of the most predictable things. But depending on what the movement itself does, Is it able to maintain resilience, discipline, strategic focus? Is it able to maintain mass participation? That's what determines whether the violence backfires against the perpetrators, meaning they lose support, they lose the moral high ground because of their response, or whether that doesn't happen and people are paralyzed or they do nothing in response. And so, anyway, so I think that period, of the Palestinian struggle continues to be very instructive.
How did you meet Erica Chenoweth?
Yeah, so I was at that time working at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which is an international nonprofit organization that is dedicated to developing, disseminating knowledge, know-how about strategic nonviolent action. I joined ICNC after wrapping up my dissertation, and I was the director of educational initiatives during that time. And so one of the very early convenings that we hosted was a meeting in Colorado to talk about how educators and scholars are researching and teaching about nonviolent action. So it was a meeting. I remember it was called People, Power, and Pedagogy. And Erica was there, and I remember very fortuitously and not planned at all, we were roommates. And so we ended up spending a lot of time at night talking about how often is nonviolent resistance really successful? You have all these classic cases of Indian independence movement and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the Chilean movement that ousted Pinochet and the US civil rights movement and the Polish solidarity movements. You have all these classic cases, but can nonviolent resistance really be effective in the most repressive environments? And is its track record really better than armed resistance? And the fact was, nobody had attempted to systematically compare the two forms of resistance. So by the end of that gathering, basically on the back of a napkin, we had plotted out the table of contents for what became Why Civil Resistance Works. Then I left the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, joined the State Department. So a lot of the writing and editing was happening while I was deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan. So I was at our embassy during that time. This was 2009 to 11. So I have, just memories of writing and editing with duck and cover sirens going off and Taliban mortars going over the embassy compound. And so it was a very surreal environment in which to be writing about the strategic efficacy of nonviolent resistance.
Wow. So, yeah, so right. So in any case, that you compiled a database of over 200 violent revolutions and over 100 nonviolent campaigns of the.
It was over about 330 total campaigns.
So what is, change the subject, what is the Horizons Project?
Yeah, so after working for decades on international issues, I've been working with movements and activists all around the world who were fighting for rights, freedom, democracy, using civil resistance. I had been studying authoritarianism, the dynamics of authoritarianism, how autocrats consolidate, maintain control, gut democratic institutions. And so, having worked all these issues for so many years internationally, seeing what was happening in my own country, certainly authoritarianism did not begin with the Trump administration. We have a long history of authoritarianism in this country. Think about Jim Crow, the system of racial apartheid in the South. That was a very quintessential form of single party authoritarian rule that was at that time consolidated in the Democratic Party. Today, the authoritarian faction is consolidated in the Republican Party, and seeing all the elements of the authoritarian playbook playing out in my backyard, I decided I needed to be able to focus more on what was happening in the United States. So I took a sabbatical from my work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, started to get involved with different democracy networks, peace building, bridge building networks, movements, groupings that were that were organizing under the Trump administration, where, after the Muslim ban, after the very anti-immigrant kind of sentiments, after, all the things that were happening during that time period, the normalization of political violence and threats, the announcement that, if the election didn't go Trump's way, he would probably not recognize the results. So all these things that we know are part of the authoritarian playbook, seeing that how focused it was in the United States, I needed to be able to focus much more on this. So the Horizons Project was being incubated at my colleague Julia Royd's old organization, Partners Global. Horizons was meant to be a platform to come together and bring different tools, perspectives, and approaches to address the crisis of democracy, the crisis of systemic racism, inequality, all these intersecting, reinforcing crises that we're facing using this variety of different tools and approaches. So that was kind of the impetus behind Horizons. We also very much bring in the international insights and perspectives. So not only what do we know about how authoritarians consolidate power, and some of your listeners may be familiar with Protect Democracy's authoritarian playbook. It's a very useful guide that I commend to folks. I would also recommend to folks the online publication Just Security. Has developed an autocrat threat tracker for the US. So if you want to go into the very specifics of the kind of most significant threats to US democracy in this moment and proposed responses and solutions, those two works, I think, are very, very helpful. So on a day-to-day basis, Spencer, we do a lot of organizing between different communities and constituencies. So we're working with movements, because the whole idea is like whether you're working on racial justice, anti-poverty, reproductive rights, environmental issues, all being affected by the attacks on democracy. So how can we build a movement of movements to be able to collectively respond? How can we bring in unlikely allies in the business sector, in the faith community, in the veterans community, in professional associations? So a lot of our work is research, but also organizing across difference, across partisan ideology, across different sectors, to be able to stubbornly say no to authoritarianism in the US and yes to a multiracial democracy.
So what in particular would you suggest for today's audience?
I mean, I think part of it is, the education of how authoritarianism works. That's why I was commending to you that the publications, both the Authoritarian Playbook and Just Security's Autocratic Threat Tracker. I think it's just important to be aware of how institutions, democratic institutions, are co-opted, are undermined, and all the things that we're seeing, the threats and political violence, the book bans, the anti-LGBTQ legislation, the anti-protester bills, the voter suppression that's happening at the state level. All of these things are part of a system, and there are ways to confront this system. So education about how authoritarianism functions, but then getting involved in organizing. I mean, it all, for me, so much goes back to local, community, state, national, and eventually international organizing to be able to bring people together to address the challenges as they're playing out locally. And I can guarantee that the various components of the authoritarian playbook are probably happening in communities where your community is operating. So how do you find common cause, whether it's through church groupings, whether it's local community-based organizations? We need to be able to come together and strategize and prepare and train, because that is how we can get better at responding. And I think, one of the key insights in doing research on civil resistance, and also on how do you help nonviolent movements most effectively if you're an outside actor, one of the key findings from that research is that training really matters. Training is important both to build skills So, how can we think about strategically sequencing nonviolent tactics? How can we think about the most likely scenarios to play out so that we can plan? What are the dialogue approaches to bring people together across difference? How do we call people in rather than calling them out? So there are very specific skills and tools that can be honed. And I think that's part of it, coming together, getting trained together, learning from other experiences. So this is another kind of part of Horizon's work, is the building of solidarity. So what is happening in Missouri, you will find happening in different states when it comes to kind of specific attacks on democracy, whether what's playing out in Florida or Texas. How do we find common cause? How do we learn about what's happening in these other places and, be speaking to each other, communicating with each other, planning together? So I think it's just finding the issues that you most care about, you're most passionate about, getting involved. If the group doesn't exist, obviously form a group, and plan how to respond using the different tools, approaches, tactics at your disposal.
So resources for that you mentioned, what is a two or three, a book called Protect Democracy, the Authoritarian Playbook, or how do I miss that?
Protect Democracy is an organization, a national organization that is focused on various attacks on democracy and authoritarianism in the US. It's trying to prevent the United States from backtracking and becoming autocratic. And so, Protect Democracy, if you go to their website, they have a lot of useful resources. The Authoritarian Playbook, I find very helpful. I also find they now have the Authoritarian Playbook for 2025, which is basically taking the statements and proposed actions of, not only Donald Trump and his closest advisors, what they've said they will do, and kind of have brought them together. Because the one thing when you focus on authoritarianism, one of the key lessons is that when an autocrat says they will do something, believe them. They will try to do it. So anyway, that's one of the resources that brings kind of different kind of analyses and toolkits together. So that's Protect Democracy. And then, there are a number of other organizations that are doing kind of movements work. So I'm thinking of the 22nd Century Initiative, that has been working with different movement organizations. They have a network meeting once a month that, again, brings people together from very different movements, very different states and parts of the country to come together around a shared analysis of what's happening and kind of how we can respond together. There are other organizations, Race Forward, which is very focused on the nexus of racial justice and democracy. They have their annual meeting coming up, actually in St. Louis, I believe. Race Forward is having their annual meeting, so there may be opportunities. So it's finding, the organizations that align with your values, and getting involved.
Okay, so I think um, we now need to request donations to cover the cost of this facility, and I hope there's someone who will circulate a basket. I don't see it, but it's got to be coming here in a moment. Um, Instructions for how to donate online should appear in the chat. Um, and we still need someone to monitor the chat so that we can get questions. Checks can be mailed to All Souls UU Church at 4501 Walnut, Kansas City, Missouri 64111. You can mention the forum in the memo line. And now, if you have questions, please come over here and line up here. Come to the microphone, speak clearly into the microphone. People watching via YouTube Live should be able to put questions in the chat. One question per person until everyone has had an opportunity to ask a question. And please, no speeches so that we can make better use of the time of our speaker. Henry?
Maria, thank you so much. I was very impressed. I'm going to try to look into these books. Um, Why is the U.S., which is presently so oppressed with huge military spending, division of our country, the democracy is under threat, why is there no mass movement concerning nonviolence and resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's probably not one movement, one mass movement for nonviolence, as you say, in challenging various forms of militarism. But I think there are lots of different movements that are happening around the country, and so I think it's a question of how to build a movement of movements. I've been involved in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which some of you may be aware of. This has been an effort to try to orient the Catholic Church away from militarism and towards a greater investment in nonviolent solutions. So lots of different groupings around that effort. So groups like Pace Bene, groups associated with the Kenyan nonviolence effort. So that's one and Pax Christi International has been kind of a driving force in that effort, an organization that many of you may be familiar with. So that's one, I think, very important grassroots movement. There are different, when I started to get more involved in US democracy issues and peace and justice issues, there are different groupings and networks that regularly meet, strategize. So I'm thinking about the Trust Network, for example. This is a group of bridge building and peace building organizations that come together, highlight good things that are happening on the ground, different forms of different organization that is happening. They've been pioneering work on an early warning, early response system to address violence. So I think, those are just a couple of examples. Many of you may be familiar with the large Kenyan nonviolence network that exists across the country. Organizations like On Earth Peace and others are very involved in this work. So I think the challenge and opportunity is to find opportunities to connect these key nodes that are focused on nonviolence, peace building, positive peace, not just the absence of violence or the absence of militarism, but the presence of justice. And I think that also the mass movement that the speaker mentioned is more likely to come about when peace groups join forces with groups that are vying for justice, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, when there can be a coming together of kind of the anti-war, pro-peace with social justice groupings. I think that stands the best chance, perhaps, of building the kind of mass movement that you spoke of. Yes.
Hi. I was interested in some of your comments about the Middle East. Given how long these conflicts have been going there, do you think peace in the Middle East is realistic?
I mean, is peace realistic? I guess that's always the perennial question, anytime. And I think peace is possible. I think we have all the tools at our disposal, knowledge and know-how to address conflicts using nonviolent, non-military means. I think it's the only way out of the tragedy also. And so I think part of it is, there's an urgent need to stop the violence, to stop the killings. And I think there will come an opportunity to rethink what needs to happen. So rethink, what will it take to end the Israeli occupation with its strong US backing? What needs to happen? What are the key pillars of support for the occupation? And how can we think about organizing in that way? So I think there are like many bright spots. Some of you may know, groups like Nonviolence International that have been in the trenches for a very long time. Israeli groups like Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, the Israeli Community Against Home Demolitions. There's a group called Standing Together, which is bringing Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinians together to resist the occupation. So I think there are a lot of, and some of you may be familiar with Jewish Voices for Peace and the work that they are doing in the US. and a lot of faith-based efforts. So I think, again, remaining hopeful that change is possible, and it's only possible when people organize and strategize, and think about the best ways to come together and exert power over this situation. So yes, I do think peace is possible, but there would need to be a significant increase in investment in all the tools and approaches that we know are necessary, the conflict resolution, the civil resistance, the civilian protection initiatives, like all of that needs greater focus and strategic focus. So what is the plan to bring all of these elements together? But yes, I believe peace is possible.
I haven't seen very much coverage in the mainstream media, even including PBS and NPR, of groups around the country that are working toward peaceful resolution of various issues. Do you see this as a kind of a led by industry and anti-governmental, anti-democratic, small d, around the country, or is this just because there's not very much work with various groups that are working, that have a overall goal of preserving democratic institutions? Do you understand the question? Is there a question in there somewhere?
Uh, I think you were asking, there are kind of countervailing forces to the pro-democracy, pro-peace groups, which seem disparate, kind of disconnected in many ways. I mean, I would say that yes, like those who are for greater kind of militarization, who are actively involved in subverting democratic norms and institutions and acting as autocrats, have significant resources at their disposal. They have funding, they have media outlets, they have corporate sector backing, they have religious support. So that's the thing. So all of the kind of authoritarian practices, not just Trump and Trumpism, but at the state level, looking at what is happening in Florida, Texas, other places, like that is held up by institutions that provide moral, spiritual, cultural, political, economic, financial support. So, what if there was collectively a coming together of churches to say no to Trumpism, saying no to authoritarianism? We have red lines, and political violence is unacceptable. Like, dehumanizing others is unacceptable. Refusing to accept the results of elections is unacceptable. So, yes, there are strong countervailing forces, but I think there are a lot of good organizations doing very good work in the United States. It was not insignificant that we prevented the success of a coup in 2020, 2021. It was not inevitable that we would prevail. A lot of other democracies have not been successful, and there's been an autocratic takeover. So I think there's a lot of potential organizing muscle across this country. And now that I'm working much more on the United States, I see it every day. I see it in all the social justice movements, bridge building, peace building, democracy networks. They exist. And they're getting much better connected. So I think this is the work, connecting the dots, strengthening the connective tissue. And that's the best way to maneuver perhaps better resourced and better funded opponent.
And we have half a dozen questions and only 15 minutes left. So if you can give shorter responses, that would help.
One thing I think most Americans do not understand is that Israel is a police state. It is a police state, just like Saudi Arabia, just like Kuwait, just like Singapore. It's a police state. Uh, the and the other thing they don't seem to understand is Joe Biden is not the prime minister of Israel. He cannot make anybody in Israel do anything. Now, the one thing he hasn't done is cut off the money, and that is in his power. How do you sort of see the United States responsibility in this, in the current conflict?
Yes, I don't disagree with anything you said about the US government, the Biden administration, providing diplomatic cover, providing military assistance, political backing for Israel during this time. I think it's very unfortunate. I think this is not an issue that is solely with the Biden administration. This is kind of a perennial challenge of US foreign policy and US Israel policy. So yes, I mean, for years, and there was some controversy when we decided to include the chapter on the First Intifada in the book, Why Civil Resistance Works. There were some people who said, "Don't do it." There will be challenges to that chapter, to that case study, and we went forward anyway because we believed in the strength of the analysis. And I think there are so this is absolutely the case that the U.S., for all intents and purposes, co-occupies, because I don't, the occupation would not be militarily, diplomatically possible without U.S. support. But that raises, I put the question back to you. So given this reality, we know about the U.S. support for Israel, the levels, the types, what is the organizing strategy to strip that support away? Who needs to be part of the coalition? What are the entry points? What are the pressure points? That's then the conversation that needs to be had to be able to strategically change U.S. policy towards Israel.
Maria, do you believe that nonviolence is the highest form of ethics, morality, spiritual life, and core principles in life?
I mean, so there is, an entire community of practice focused on principled nonviolence. So what you are articulating is principled nonviolence, and I believe it is incredibly powerful. I believe that nonviolence has the potential both to challenge injustices and to heal communities, and so the power to heal, to reconcile, to be able to achieve coexistence is possible with nonviolence. I have tended to focus on the strategic applications of nonviolent action because I'm aware that not everyone comes at this from a principled perspective. And as Quaker activist practitioner George Lakey famously wrote, most people who participate in nonviolent resistance are not pacifists, and most pacifists do not participate in nonviolent resistance. So I firmly believe in meeting people where they're at and offering an approach, a perspective that this is an effective way to fight back. It is an effective way to advance rights, freedoms, and democracy. So I believe having both a principled approach and a strategic, pragmatic approach together is a wonderful combination. And I believe engaging people where they're coming from, where they're at, is very important. And I do believe in the strategic power and potential of nonviolent resistance.
Hello, Maria. Thank you for coming. This is a question from our chat. Do you have thoughts on how to address how many Americans seem to be ready to embrace authoritarian leaders and policies?
Yeah, I've seen some of those surveys and polls. It's very disturbing. Also, the percentage of Americans who would be willing to use political violence to advance goals. So it's very troubling, and very concerning. And one thing to know about autocrats is that they're very good at tapping into people's fears, insecurities, confusion, to be able to, divide us in order to rule. The old stratagem of divide and rule. And so, what we're seeing, around the world, and whether, it's in this country, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary or Erdogan in Turkey, Bukele in El Salvador, Bolsonaro in Brazil, they tap into these insecurities and anxieties in order to say, you need to be prepared to let us do everything, and we are here to protect you. And so otherwise, you're powerless to bring about change, and your way of life is being threatened, your existence is being threatened, and only we can defend it. And that's how, like, there's an allure to that. When you're uncertain, when you're confused, it can seem very attractive. Like, simple solutions can be very attractive, So the counter is like to complexify these narratives to show that, like, these autocratic strategies are not going to bring about greater peace and security, and to be able to, organize around that.
Question I have relates to leadership or nonviolent processes. I would think of Mahatma Gandhi in India being the figurehead, Martin Luther King in America. Do we have such a leader, let's say in the United States now, that could do that role?
So I think there are many leaders, and I would prefer a leader situation. It's never a leaderless situation. It's generally many different leaders, and I think it's important to study the famous leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Bacha Khan, who led the Khudai Khidmatgar movement. This was an all-Muslim nonviolent army, incidentally the first nonviolent army in the history of the world that resisted the British Raj, British colonialism. So it's important to study these figureheads, and often it's the men that are listed as well. We don't talk as much about Ella Baker and Diane Nash and all the kind of key women leaders who have led successful nonviolent struggles in our own country, in our own history. However, movements do not succeed or fail because of charismatic leaders. Movements succeed or fail because of good organization and good strategy. And the ability of movements to build leadership within their ranks, to help people grow, advance, like, that's the hallmark of successful nonviolent movements. So yes, key leaders can give hope, inspiration, vision. That's all critically important. And the work of successful nonviolent resistance is investing in the organization, and investing in bringing lots of people together and developing their leadership potential, which is what most of the greatest leaders have been able to do.
This is another question from our chat. What can be done about outside parties promoting violent groups, such as Iran and Syria promoting Hamas and Hezbollah?
Yeah, so this issue of kind of outside actors that kind of strengthen autocrats. When I was in the State Department, my last assignment was working with the Syrian opposition. So this was about a year into their nonviolent uprising against the Assad dictatorship, one of the most brutal regimes in the Middle East. And I remember not only the brutality of the response to the peaceful protesters, and these were Sunni Muslims, these were Alawites, these were Christians, Druze that rose up against the Assad dictatorship. But he was always able to evade sanctions because he maintained strong support with Putin, and Putin provided military assistance as well. And so it's very difficult when the supporters of these regimes are other autocratic states. It's very, very difficult because it's very hard to ally with groups in those countries to be able to challenge their own governments, backing of different dictators elsewhere. It's very difficult. So I think the best thing that can be done is to strengthen the ability of groups inside these countries, whether it's Syria, Russia, Iran, showing solidarity with these nonviolent activists, pro-democracy activists, amplifying their stories, getting them out there to counter the kind of authoritarian narrative that these human rights defenders, these protesters, these are just foreign-backed agents. That's a very common refrain of autocrats. Anytime they're facing protests in their own countries, they will declare that the protesters are foreign agents. It's very, so there has to be a way to, counter that, to support the activists. I think the sanctions regimes, you're probably seeing a lot about sanctions right now as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. They can be effective, especially if they're targeted, if you go after oligarchs and their lavish lifestyles. But you also can't rely on a sanctions regime to be able to kind of undermine autocratic support. So the best bet really is investing in the people who are leading kind of the nonviolent organizing in those countries.
Do you have any comments on the recent rally of Nazis in Nashville?
Um, so I haven't, I'm not as familiar with that incident, although I've been, certainly following the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Western State Center, who have been tracking far right, white nationalist, neo-Nazi mobilizations across the country. And so, and I think, now maybe what is different is that this is all more out in the open. It's these actions have been somewhat normalized. There was Charlottesville. There was a Charlottesville rally as well. And so I think, this also reveals that this strain of white nationalism and white Christian nationalism has been with us for a very long time. The difference now is that you have one of the main political parties either actively or passively endorsing these groups. And that's what is incredibly dangerous in this moment. And so, again, you look at cases where communities have fought back, it's because they organize, they use creative tactics to, raise awareness of what was happening, counter rallies, counter demonstrations, centering love, centering joy. So there are ways to respond to these groups. It may not involve protests. So confronting these groups in the streets directly head on head is often not the best approach. So there are other ways to respond, get people involved, get voices, out there to condemn the actions of these groups, and to find other creative ways to show that their actions, their beliefs are not supported by the communities.
Great. So the the Patriot Act basically makes it illegal to teach nonviolence to anyone designated as a terrorist by the U.S. State Department, according to the Supreme Court decision Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project. Talk about that.
I would just say, without being a lawyer or a legal expert, there absolutely has to be ways to provide training to groups in strategic nonviolent action and nonviolent responses. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, probably the strongest finding in the, systematic analysis that Erica and I did of the role of external actors vis-a-vis nonviolent movements. So the training, the preparation, the planning, learning from other experiences is like the most effective way that outside actors can support nonviolent movements. So this is probably, and this is why the Horizons Project has been centering training so much and working with a cohort of trainers from across the US called the Growers Guild. These are civil resistors, these are organizers, these are conflict resolution people, these are mediators. We believe very strongly in that. We have an international component to the Growers Guild, people who bring in, experiences challenging extremism and democratic backsliding in their countries. One of the most important things, and maybe a silver lining of this terrible moment in kind of Israel-Palestine, is hopefully there's an awareness. There needs to be massive investment in alternatives. Nonviolent resistance is a skill-based activity. People can improve, get better, grow. And so this ought to be the focus. And I think you look at groups like Nonviolence International, groups like Just Vision, if folks are not familiar with the work of Just Vision is an organization that has been documenting Palestinian-led nonviolent resistance for years. They've done documentary films. One is called Nyla and the Uprising, about the role of Palestinian women during the first Intifada. Remarkable. They've done a film called Budrus about the nonviolent resistance challenging the separation wall barrier in the occupied territories. And they have a new film called Boycott. And so there are organizations in key nodes that have resources, tools, approaches. So those are the groups that should be supported strongly in this moment. And I think that is probably the best way to get to an alternative future is strengthening the skills and capacities of nonviolent organizing and nonviolent resistance.
Great. Just a reminder, each week's program is broadcasted roughly on KKFI roughly a week and a half later. This presentation will likely air a week from Tuesday, March 12th, that is, 7 to 8 p.m. on 90.1 FM, or you can go to kkfi.org, any place with a adequate internet connection, and click listen at that time. This presentation will also be condensed to a half an hour and broadcasted nationwide on Sprouts. It's carried on something like a 50 different Pacifica radio network stations. If you want to share this with others, invite them to search for the forum at All Souls Church YouTube channel at allsoulskc.org, or after 8 p.m. on March 12th. You can go to kkfi.org, then News and Public Affairs, then All Souls Forum, and you can find this episode with a podcast. Next week, Emily Penrose McLaughlin, Executive Director of Help Ed Connect, will discuss their work and why it is important for people living near here. And two more shameless plugs. This afternoon, 2 to 4 p.m., Peaceworks Kansas City is meeting in the Simpson House, and you're all invited. The other thing is May 4th and 5th, Mubarak Awad will be here in Kansas City, the founder of Nonviolent International, Palestinian leader, to do a workshop with me on the role of the media in violent and nonviolent conflict, followed by, he will be speaking at the forum on May 5th. So thank you again, Maria. You are all invited to stay for the church services, which begins in Bragg Auditorium down the hall at 10:45, or via All Souls UU Church KC YouTube channel at allsoulskc.org. And yes.